Hello and good evening. My name is David Magyar, a director at John Robertson Architects, and on behalf of the City Architecture Forum, I have great pleasure in introducing tonight's digital talk on the 77 Coleman building, part of the forum's Revealing the City series. As I'm sure many of you will already know, this is a much talked about retrofit project, a substantial refurbishment, remodeling and extension of a 1980s building on a prominent site in the heart of the city for Kojima Properties. To tell us all about it, I'd like to introduce this evening's speakers, Victoria Cooper of Buckley Gray Yeoman, the architects for the scheme, and Gordon Armstrong-Payne of Heyne Tillett Steel, who carried out the structural engineering wizardry. Victoria's an associate at BGY and led the design and delivery of 77 Coleman. She's got a range of experience across the commercial and residential sector and is currently leading the design of a new headquarters for a global brand, a series of gallery spaces and an 80 million retrofit of a building also in the City of London. I'm very envious. Victoria takes joy in resolving problems beautifully, as you will see shortly in tonight's presentation. Gordon is a senior structural engineer at the engineering practice Heyne Tillett Steel and also has experience across a number of sectors, including office, retail and hospitality. He's been involved with a number of heavy refurbs within the central London area, and as will become evident shortly, he particularly enjoys working with the wider design team to develop efficient and elegant solutions for complex engineering challenges. Both will be telling us about the background to the project, the design narrative, and the challenges and complexities they encountered in the process of realizing this building. At a time when reusing, repurposing buildings is increasingly coming to the fore, I think 77 Coleman represents a benchmark for this approach and the new workplace. It's a project that illustrates the creative and commercial potential of projects of this kind and how, through good design, we can avoid demolition, create a working environment that is sustainable, well considered, and has identity in abundance, all of which will have considerable allure for tenants and office users post-pandemic. To achieve all this, 77 Coleman has involved some extremely clever engineering, something that often doesn't get the credit it deserves. So I'm very pleased to say today's talk will reveal more about this aspect of the project. Before I ask Victoria and Gordon to get going, please note that questions can be asked via the Q&A button on your Zoom menu, and I'll be directing a selection of these to our speakers once they have concluded the talk. We're aiming to get through the presentations by about 7:15-ish at the latest, and hoping to close around 7:30 promptly. So, Victoria, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. That was a really good introduction. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully everybody now can see that. So yeah, 77 Coleman, an old building made new in the city. And 77 Coleman Street demonstrates, particularly at BGY and HTS, our approach to retaining and refurbishing buildings rather than simply knocking down and starting again. This is becoming more and more important as we look at sustainability issues and how we look at existing building stock, particularly in the City of London. It's really important to say that this is a coming together of a client who had the right aspirations, a building that could deal with the heavy cut and carve and new approach we took to it, and also the design team coming together, and hopefully that will come across in this evening's presentation. A really important fact that I think we're all really pleased with is 78% of the 1980 existing building, the concrete was retained, which is quite substantial, particularly when you think about what we've achieved and how the building feels like a new offering today. And at the same time, this is how the entrance facade looks on the right. it feels entirely new, but we hope sits comfortably in the context of the surrounding buildings. And also on the left, this is an image of the existing coffered ceiling that we made good, repurposed, and actually used to heavily influence our interior design approach to the building. So this evening, we want to talk to you about kind of 6 key themes, starting with how the building began, how we found it in 2015, when we started on this project, our key moves in making this happen. And those kind of form part of the following 4 points: how we look to reinstate the city grain, develop sustainably, reposition 77 Coleman Street in the market, and also the arrival experience. And that last point is particularly important as employees start to think about returning to the office post-COVID in a very different way after the last few months we've all experienced. So to give you a quick overview of the programme, as I said, BGY won the competition in early 2015. Towards the end of that year and into 2016, we underwent 3 pre-apps with the City of London, and planning was submitted and approved fairly swiftly under delegated powers, which we were really pleased with. Then we continued under a fairly linear fashion through the REBA stages, and we started on site in spring 2018, and we were on site for just over 2 years. So how the building began, as you know, it's in the City of London and sits just to the south of London Wall, and Moorgate flanks what was previously the face of the building, but it forms part of this city block. So it has 2 key facades, one onto Moorgate and one onto Coleman Street. Importantly as well, the Elizabeth line is due to open for Crossrail. Obviously there have been some delays, but the impact of that and the resulting footfall impacted our overall design. And also an aerial shot there, you can see that thoroughfare of Moorgate flanking the building, and also Finsbury Circus, which sits just north to the site. The building is in the Bank Conservation Area, and of course that was particularly important during planning and also when considering viewing corridors regarding St Paul's. So understanding the historic context, everybody is generally much more familiar with Moorgate. It's a thoroughfare that obviously links down to Bank a bit further south, but actually Coleman Street is a much older street, and you can see here the building which once sat here, but before Moorgate was actually formed. Moving on to this map from 1802, you can see the plan to introduce Moorgate as well, which flanked the east side. And finally, the city block, as we know it today, owned as one piece of land. And moving slightly further out, something that's really prevalent in this city grain is the number of alleyways that permeate the city block. And this is particularly important for pedestrian and cycling use, which is something that began to seem to us like it could offer an opportunity about how we start to penetrate the city block. As you can see, just to the south, we potentially had an opportunity to knock through from Coleman Street to Moorgate. It's important as well to look at the more current architecture. Like it or not, I think it's very fair to say there's real variation from high tech to postmodern to pastiche, and this sort of opened up many options for us in terms of how we approached the elevation design. This was our beauty that we found back in 2015. As I said, finished in the 1980s. Very little relationship with the public realm, heavily clad in granite and tinted windows, and the interiors also were incredibly dated, much to do with the fact that the building was in need of an upgrade. So what were our key moves? And there were 4 key moves that really unlocked the site to us, which I'm going to talk through now. So first of all, as I've alluded to, how do we look to reinstate the city grain? Equally, we need to develop sustainably, and this was very much about adding scale and mass and additional office provision. Looking to reposition the building as 77 Coleman. And finally, thinking about that arrival experience, which was a really positive process. And in hindsight, I think we feel almost preempted what the workplace needs to look like more in the future. So first of all, reinstating the city grain in sort of diagram form. You've got Moorgate then to the east, Coleman Street to the right, and by potentially opening up Nunn Court, which was previously a dead end, opportunities also arose to potentially flip the entrance of the building onto the more pedestrian and greener side of the building. This was Nunn Court with Coleman Street to the back of us as it once looked, a service yard, a fire exit, and unpleasant behaviour, not somewhere you particularly wanted to go, and there were definitely opportunities that we needed to take advantage of. So the plan here, Nunn Court sits just to the south of the building, and the view from the camera was looking up this way. Of course, as you can see in pink, lots of the office floor plate previously was taken up by staircases, circulation, WCs, and really wasn't very efficient in any way. So one of our key moves was moving the entire core to the north of the building. And by doing that, it unlocked the opportunity to open up Nunn Court all the way to Moorgate. The other thing, of course, is having retail frontage that's overlooking this space. All of a sudden, it becomes a real excitement point of activity and a much safer, more attractive space for people to use. Finally, one of the really important parts of our competition was flipping the building on its side so that the entrance space is entirely on Coleman Street with retail to Moorgate, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. And I must mention, of course, as well, that was really helpful for the planning process. The planners were really pleased to see this approach. So Nunn Court, as we began to visualise it, this was standing on Moorgate. You can see down the route looking towards what is now the reception space, and it's flanked on one side by really good retail space, cafe, bar, restaurant, etc. And we also introduced this faience glazed tile to the left to add interest. And then this is sitting in what the reception space was, looking back towards Moorgate. Now, what that looks like today, this is pre-let in terms of there are no occupiers when this photo was taken, but you do have this entrance into Nunn Court, which kind of lures you into the space. And you can see just at the end, the doors which take you into the reception space. Again, including cycle access to the basement that's located down Nunn Court. And this is private land, but is very much appearing to be public. So that relationship with the public realm is really important here and has worked very well. As I said, these glazed faience tiles are actually, the inspiration from this was the fact that the building used to be a glass making factory. So of course, pre-low iron glass, there was always that green tinge. And so we wanted to introduce that kind of element of colour and interest in what otherwise externally is a very kind of calm building. And picking up on a few more of the details, this creates a really lovely rhythm and also lighting features down that space. In hand with this, of course, we were working for Kojima Properties, our client, and it's really important that we looked to develop sustainably, but in a holistic manner. So it's an aspirational building, it's high quality, but we need to think about sustainability not just as a tag on getting our BREEAM credits, etc., but our entire approach to the building. So of course, this poses one major question. Do we knock down and start again? What about the quality of materials? We want this building to last much longer than the 1980s original building. Supporting workspace for the future This included achieving wired score platinum, which is all about connectivity, and also environmental credentials, including BREEAM, and of course, retaining the concrete frame. And also optimizing the relationship with the external space within the realms that is possible. And all this came together to ensure it was viable as a commercial development and fit for purpose, and also future-proof. So this poses our sort of model for significant reconfiguration. And I'm going to hand over to Gordon from HGS to talk about the structural strategy.
Thanks, Victoria. So yeah, just to take you through a few of the key aspects that we've obviously had to do in order to achieve that very impressive 78% of the existing frame that was retained. So what we started with was the 1980s concrete frame building, which was then developed to include this new 3-storey steel framed extension. In order to do that, we'll discuss quickly, obviously we had to undertake a lot of 3D modelling at an early stage, very good archive information, and then that was backed up with extensive site testing, which provided the most informed approach for developing an efficient scheme, which maximised the reuse of all the existing elements. And as I say, that pushed every element to the limit to achieve that at 78%. So 4 key aspects: the existing building and the proposals, then looking at the reuse of the existing building, and then considering the low carbon design, and then sort of where Victoria and I worked more particularly in close harmony, looking at the structural and how that was then left on show in some of the more interesting features of the building. So what we started with was, as Victoria said, a 1980s concrete frame. In the initial building was built in the 1920s. It was demolished, the basement was extended, and then what we had here was what was constructed in 1980. So we removed what was this very dated interior, not very light, with this glazed atrium in the middle. That was demolished, and you will see that we took off the top single storey. And as Victoria mentioned, one of the key aspects was moving the core from the south elevation to the north to open that up. The image on the right was what we had to do to facilitate these works, so forming a very large opening in the north facade, vertically down to the basement to form that new core. Then with the new structure, that was built off of the existing level 5 slab, up 3 new stories, so 2 occupied with a single story of plant on the roof. And as I say, the new core was repositioned to the north. What we also managed to do was rebuild the south facade, which you'll see on the next slide, in blue to the south, which opened up that elevation. The previous arrangement of structure had these isolated cores. As Victoria mentioned, that cut off Nunn Court from the two Coleman Street and Moorgate side. So by removing them and the isolated shear walls in the middle and combining them into a single structural core to the north gave us a lot more flexibility in the floor plate. In order to do that, there was a lot of early work that had to be done, as I mentioned. We were very lucky with this project that the archive drawings that we were able to retrieve from sources like the LMA, the online data room that the client had, they were extensive. We had pile calculations down to the original reinforcement drawings. And that gives a very good basis for enabling the existing structure to be rejustified for its intended use. That doesn't give the whole story. We obviously have to back that up with a number of site investigations, which are done early on to validate that with an open-minded client who were willing to take that slightly increased risk to consider that they could reuse the existing building. So, for instance, here we undertook existing cores from the piles, and we actually managed to justify the reuse of all the existing foundations. So, by not having any new piles, the only new elements within the ground were 2 pile caps to facilitate the new core. Everything else was reused, which, when substructure is considered, probably 17 to 18% of the embodied carbon of a structure, it's quite a significant saving on what would have been new piles in an existing building or a rebuild, as Victoria said. And then we do a lot of other opening up works to validate those archive drawings. In doing that, we obviously, as I've mentioned, we reconfigured the internal core and rejustified 78% of those. over across the whole building, we achieved 161 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared of embodied carbon across the GIA. Now, when you compare that to Leti and Reba, against an approximate 50 to 55% of their target would account for structure, they would generally be between 250 to 300 kilograms of CO2 per metre squared for this type of building. So we're well within that, very impressive target. And obviously what we've got at the end of it is a building that looks new, but has a lot of retained structure. This slide here is part of our modelling process that we do at HTS for every project that we pick up. It's looking at the existing frame, the elements that we take out, and then what we have at the end. And that whole life cycle carbon analysis gives a very good indication to all clients as to where savings can be made and where efficiencies can be made, particularly when we're looking at structure. So 3,500 tonnes of CO2 was retained in that frame, which otherwise would have gone to landfill should have been demolished. So very impressive. The structural aesthetic, so something that is not generally common nowadays is the construction of new waffle slabs. So in order to give this continuity of existing meeting new, within the exposed soffit of the ground floor reception, we had to actually demolish 2 bays of existing flat slab and re-provide this new section of waffle. Now, the image on the left is actually new and existing in the final case. So the bay on the left is new and the bay on the right is existing. And there was obviously a lot of work done to get these waffles matching the existing cases, given obviously it was built around about 40 years ago. So there's a lot of tracking down of the existing moulds, which you can see on the right, in order to actually get these to match. But in the end, it ended up a very, very good detail. The other consideration from an architectural and structural perspective was achieving these open floor plates. So in the original case, we've obviously got an RC grid, generally around 6.6 by 6.6. That was matched on the proposed floors, and the column grid was replicated. However, to make that space feel larger, the columns were minimised, and we've actually adopted 120 CHSs on the same grid with a very slim non-composite floor build-up. So the image on the right, as you can see, it gives you a very expansive floor plate with a minimalistic column, which is quite impressive. And to further enhance that open feel with the 2 glazed elevations on both Coleman Street and Moorgate, we managed to remove these non-structural upstands that were on every floor across both elevations, by cutting them out with very minimal structural work due to them not being structural, and it was the case of cutting and repairing. You get this feel of a brand new concrete frame, which you typically would have on any new build, with these floor-to-ceiling windows bringing in the light on both elevations. And yeah, just to finish off, I think, as you can see from this one, the 7th floor terrace overlooking the city is a very impressive space. That doesn't feel like you're on top of an existing RC frame that was built 40 years ago.
Thanks very much, Gordon. And to move on from that, this kind of leads us back to the fact that we were providing 2 additional floors of office space, of course, because we were in the conservation area. Scale, mass, the impact of a bigger building needs to be considered very carefully. And you can see here on the left a typical floor plate at the bottom with our structural grid that Gordon was just discussing, and then 2 new floors, level 6, where we've got terraces on both sides, and level 7 as well, where we created this loggia type approach, where you have one covered terrace right at the top of the building. This was taken by drone, but this is basically that loggia space now overlooking Moorgate, and the intention here was very much to try and avoid that kind of wedding cake stepped back approach to adding extra height to existing buildings, and rather to approach it as a generous 1-storey element that, of course, behind is then broken up into 2. And these are just a couple of photos looking out from the office floor plates, and basking in the sun as well on a summer day. But these spaces have been really successful, probably one of the most impressive elements of the building. Of course, in terms of a viable, sustainable building, it's also thinking about all of those supporting spaces. We did superloos for the WCs. This is actually particularly favourable post-COVID in terms of hygiene, also considering wayfinding. And we've got 148 cycles as well in the basement, supported with showers and changing rooms as well. And of course, then the entrance arrival space where you can begin to see these coffers being revealed, which we'll come back to shortly. And a really important part of the building was rebranding. This is about repurposing it in the market. We work with a branding team, and of course, it's not called Moorgate anymore. It's 77 Coleman, a new identity. And for us, it was really important that then the elevations, the facades, gave this building an entirely new feeling. As Gordon said, because we were working with the existing frame, our starting point was, of course, analysing the existing elevations and stripping back the existing cladding to reveal this very sort of logical, rational structural grid which dictated the composition of our new facades. And then also how the relationship of the existing building up to level 5 was dealt with the extensions above. This is then overlaying our new facade. So we've got Moorgate, which is clad in a Mollianus limestone, and Coleman Street, which is a mixture of a handmade dark brick and also the Mollianus to link the two together. Looking a bit more closely then, we started to look at the different bays, and for the architects who are listening in, these will look familiar, but working really carefully, considering how the brickwork was set out. We used a Flemish bond and actually used lime mortar, and we were able to reduce our mortar joints from 10 mil to 8 mil. Doesn't sound a lot, but it does make a really big impact on such a big facade. And then equally looking at the entrance reveals how the Mollianus came and sat on the floor, and the signage as well on the entrance. We enjoyed a trip to Portugal, to the quarry, to look at the limestone, and these are some photos of dry laying, testing the quality of the stone in the factory. And we also had 4 life size mock-ups built of the facade. This is often something clients don't like to do for the obvious reason, it's expensive, but it was a really valuable process to ensure quality and also drill down on some of those difficult detailing, waterproofing, thermal qualities, etc. And it's really paid off now as you look at the 2 facades with the Coleman Street on the left and Moorgate on the right. And just below you can see some of those early visuals, and we're really pleased. We actually think the final views look even better than the visuals. Better again is how the 80s building once sat. This is along Coleman Street in comparison to the newly clad building, which sits quite quietly. Of course, Portland stone is the material. Along Moorgate, it wasn't something we wanted to shout about. We wanted to design this building for the city that sat comfortably in the context. And we're really pleased that this has turned out sort of to the quality that it has done. And then on Coleman Street, again, taking off the facades to the left and recladding with the brickwork and the stone. There's more variation in terms of materiality of this side of the building, which is why we introduced the handmade brick as well. And again, this kind of locates it with the city further to the east. We're generally sort of mid-rise buildings in this area, and then the much larger buildings looming in the background. And finally, possibly the most important part of the building is the arrival experience. As we talk to clients today about their workspace, it's becoming more and more important, and how amenity supports employees in the spaces they work. So this is the approach from Coleman Street, and you can see here on the ground floor plan, about half of the ground floor is given over to that entrance. Again, for a client, this is great. It's kind of music to our ears as architects, because it gives us a great opportunity to do much more than just provide a reception desk and some lifts to head up to your meeting. And you can see then the approach from Coleman Street, but also Nunn Court, kind of making this a really dynamic, interesting space. This also goes kind of full circle back to those lovely coffers, and this was a huge influence in terms of how we designed the space. We actually had to reveal these under layers of plasterboard. There were unistrut fixings all cast into the concrete, and we underwent a process that probably went on for about 3 years of testing different ways to finish it. But it was not just something to look at. It also forms these clear bays that you can see in pink and begins to zone the spaces and indicate different uses for the space. So we have the main promenade that comes to the reception desk. Up above, you've got 4 lifts that take you up to your relevant office floor. And then there are other opportunities to introduce what we've done here, which is a cafe to the bottom left here, seating and kind of almost like a co-working approach, and also to kind of give the whole space more of a hotel lobby feeling. So of course, co-working, we keep talking about flexibility, agile working. How do we do this? Offer opportunities for people to undertake different types of activity. That hotel lobby feeling, as we said, we've got a cafe bar, really excited that there's going to be an independent cafe operator moving in, and then also bar lounge type seating that can be used throughout the day and hopefully into the evening as well. And in turn, this sat really well with a really rich material palette. You can see the green faience that we used in Nunn Court. We used resin-bound terrazzo for the floors, reeded glass, again, which was a nod to the building's history. And we also designed the furniture and fittings and dressed the space. This shot kind of gives you an impression of what those coffers now look like. The influence on the space you can see mirrored in the pattern of the floor, and then introducing banquette seating with reeded glass to give that division, but still retain a level of visual connection through the spaces. The main route with Coleman Street behind you, heading towards the reception desk here, the kind of co-working lounge feeling. Even the matwell was designed so it reflected the grid of the soffit down on the floor, rather than putting in something when it started raining in London, which the agents hate and often happens with these type of buildings. And then the kind of cafe space with both loose and fitted furniture. And this is a bespoke cafe counter that was made from the same resin-bound terrazzo that we used on the floor, which is a really lovely crafted piece of furniture. And looking back at that as you approach them from the main entrance doors. Again, these are some of the finished furniture fittings. We introduced this velvet curtain, which is rather luxurious and actually conceals a huge sheer wall of concrete, which was a remnant of the existing building. And some of those details, as you can imagine, this was not an easy task achieving this, but it's come out really well. The curve is a gentle nod to the kind of radius of the coffers above. And the craftsmanship, we work very closely with lighting designers to integrate that into the furniture. And even within the lifts, we have etched patterns of the historic maps of the building for people to enjoy as they move around the space. We were lucky enough to just fit in the window and were able to take part in open house earlier in the summer. So a few people, members of the public, have been able to have a look around. And it's really important to say as well, the client, Kojima Properties, were excellent to work for. And it was a real combination of teams at BGY, at HTS, Volker Fitzpatrick were the contractor. And the budget came in at £29 million. And I think that's about it from me and Gordon for the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much.
Victoria, Gordon, thank you for a first-class presentation. Super impressive scheme. Well done to all involved. I'm afraid I can't let you kick back just yet, though, as we now have some Q&A, and I hope to be fielding a number of questions and really to give our audience a little bit of time to formulate those. Let me ask you myself the very first. 77 Coleman's come onto the market at, I think, a very interesting moment. The pandemic's accelerated a lot of the changes to ways of working and workplace expectations. And I think many anticipate that the office will have and will need to have a very different emphasis and attraction for tenants and users. To be drawn out of their bedrooms and kitchens and back into the workplace one day. I can see 77 Coleman being viewed very favourably in this context. But what features in particular do you think will set this building apart from competing offers? I guess this one's first for you, Victoria, but I'm sure, Gordon, your thoughts would be interesting too.
Yeah, no, a really interesting question, and a subject that we're talking to many clients about, and also how we design as architects to ensure people want to come back to offices. And actually, I think what's really interesting over the last few months, the result of that feels like there's a demand for better quality workspace, and that's definitely not a bad thing for designers. Of course, we do see lots of buildings that have flipped quickly to attract new tenants and then require more work again 5 years down the line. And this does come back both to, I think, the fact that the design team, but really importantly, the client, aligned in terms of the aspirations for the building. And we were fortunate in many ways that we did all of the support spaces, we did the cycles, we did the toilets to a really good standard. But that reception space, I think, as you say, is absolutely key. A couple of people have said, actually, if I went into that reception space to work every day, I'd be pretty happy. And you think, yeah, it's pretty good. And many office spaces don't provide anything, near that level. We worked really closely with the agents as well. And fortunately, the building's letting really well. I don't think we have much more to go, which is really impressive in the year we've had, considering we finished the building in July. And also the retail spaces are being fitted out. So I think that new brand, that repositioning of the building in the city, and ultimately that reception space and everything else it offers other than its kind of core functions is hopefully what sets the building apart.
Thank you. Good, Gordon.
I think just to add to that, Victoria, with obviously the upper floors, what we've ended up with compared to what was there in terms of an open floor plate that gives you that flexibility and that abundance of natural light, which with very little structural input in terms of opening up the facades, we've managed to achieve. And I think that it gives you to have effectively 3 elevations with full floor to ceiling windows. It's a very pleasant space to be in. And I think hopefully that is quite an attraction, not on obviously just the proposed floors, but on the existing floors in the lower levels, which may not necessarily always be the floors that would let quicker. So yeah, hopefully the product at the end of the day is this high quality product that Victoria's talked about. That is an enjoyable and pleasant place to work.
And do you think the decision to, I'm sure there's many reasons for switching the address to Coleman Street, but was one of them that connection with a piece of public realm? That's clearly a very attractive thing to have on your doorstep.
Yeah, that was huge. It was quite a bold decision during the competition to flip it, because as I said, everybody knows Moorgate. It's kind of quite a good address in many respects, but it's also a really busy vehicular thoroughfare. And actually, as you say, there's this really lovely, pleasant space on the other side of the building. So again, we were really pleased that Kojima went with that. And I think that wouldn't have happened unless we had Nunn Court to support it, for sure. The other thing is Moorgate is becoming kind of more of a retail focus at ground floor, so it very much sits well in terms of locating the main retail spaces on that side of the building. But yeah, it was a risk, I would say.
Yeah, no, I think it was well taken, and it's paid off. I'm going to encourage people to start sending in a few more questions, and no doubt if there are any agents in the audience, I'm sure they'll have a few comments to make too. I have at the moment got 2 questions in. One of them is, how are the 2 basements in the building used? Obviously, we've had a little peek with the cycle facilities. Would you like to expand on that, Victoria?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question, and actually something we didn't really talk about much, probably because it feels like a slightly less exciting part of the building, but it's a really good point. So as the person who asked the question says, there are 2 levels of basement. So the building is ground +7 +2 below, so much bigger than you might think. And at the lower basement, half of it effectively is plants. But that then leaves you with an entire half of the building, which is pretty much full up of cycle space, showers, changing, which is really kind of top class. And again, will support those kind of tenant requirements, particularly as people are getting on their bikes, running to work more, etc. And then lower ground floor is entirely shell and core for retail opportunities. And actually, HTS are working at the moment at some alterations for the incoming tenants in that space as well.
Great. Well, that was from Richard Saxon, by the way, one of our illustrious CAF members. He always asks good questions.
Very good.
Thank you. Phil Cooper asks, why did you choose Portuguese limestone rather than stone from nearer home? And were the bricks from abroad too? You thought maybe this would come up.
Yeah, that, again, really good question, particularly in terms of carbon footprint, etc. We did consider Portland stone. The reason we went for the Molianus was because of cost advantages, but also the density of the stone. So probably lots of you are familiar with the fact that Portland stone often gets really grotty and dirty very quickly. And that was something we did not want to make the same mistake with. And Molianus was actually put forward by the stone subcontractors. I won't lie, I was really nervous about it at first, but having visited the quarry and looking at the quality of the stone and the fact that it's denser, more robust, that was really what led us in that direction. I think it's a really good and important question about where materials come from. If something's being flown in from China, we need to be asking ourselves if that's the right thing to do or whether we should be looking at something closer to home. I'm pleased to say the bricks were actually made in the Midlands, so that was all relatively local, and that obviously is the majority of the Coleman Street facade and also the South facade. I think as well, right down to furniture these days, we are being asked to ensure we're considering all of the embodied carbon. Where are these? What are the processes of finishing these pieces of furniture? Where are the fabrics coming from? And so that is driving more and more at earlier stages of projects to make sure we've got the right sustainability credentials. So yeah, good question. Hopefully that answers it somewhat.
Yeah, I think on a similar theme, Nancy Elgarth asks us, with the emphasis on sustainability in the construction of buildings, does the same desire get passed on to the tenants to ensure that the intrinsic legacy of the building is maintained? It's probably a tricky one to answer, but
yeah, that is. I know Nancy Elgarth as well. Yeah, she's testing me now. Of course, as you say, we only have so much control of that because we're designing the Cat A fit out effectively for the incoming tenants. What I would say in terms of ventilation, provision, lighting, future-proofing, connectivity, we certainly did as much as we could for those buildings. But there does need to be more rigor, I would say, for incoming tenants to kind of bind them to the same requirements. But what we are experiencing now is things like wellness criteria and accreditation, which is becoming more important. It's moving up the agenda. With that and sustainability, there's much more emphasis on fit out. So certainly for other projects that we're doing one in Covent Garden, for example, where we're looking at levels of VOCs, where materials are found, making sure all of the correct requirements are fulfilled is top of the agenda. We don't have that much control over these particular tenants, but certainly I would say we and the client did what we could for Cat A.
Yeah, thank you. I think schemes like Neighbours UK, which I believe is gaining some traction, will certainly be putting more emphasis on the tenants being part of the piece in that sense. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how things evolve from here. Simon O asks, what type of air conditioning system has been installed in the building?
That's also a good one. So we used an underfloor distribution system. So in order to achieve really clean soffits and maximize the floor to ceiling heights, we have a 300 zone from the top of slab to the FFL, finished floor level. And effectively, there's ductwork that is connected right up to the roof for incoming and extracting the air, and that's pumped into the floor and comes up through grills to ensure the condition of the space is achieved. The other thing about that, which is really positive, is there's a level of flexibility. So these tiles can be moved in the floor plates as required by the incoming tenants, as inevitably they divide up the space to an extent. And the other thing, I think, as Gordon said, the really kind of light-filled office floors is such a contrast from what it was previously. We've actually got over 3 meter floor to ceiling heights on the typical floors, which you would never see on a new building. And the underfloor distribution system certainly only helped with that.
That's great. And what I guess you're saying there, Victoria, sort of implies that you had this, you know, what O'Varup used to call total design approach. And Gordon, you must have enjoyed working, you know, really from early conceptual stage with Victoria and her team, and I guess the M&E engineers as well. It must have been a pretty integrated team working very closely together to get the right result.
It definitely was, yeah. You know, from the get-go, there was always a lot on sustainability and that future adaptability for the final space, and I think that was at the forefront of all the decisions that the team came to. And as you say, David, that does take a lot of work up front in a project, and there's a lot of commitment early on to achieve that before you go too far down the road. But I think we can all say that what we've got at the end was very much worth the effort.
Yes, indeed. This is an anonymous question. What were the pros and cons of using lime mortar?
It has more movement in it than cement mortar, which means it reduces the amount of movement joints you require. And obviously they're the big fat kind of rubbishy plastic looking lines that you often see down the middle of buildings. We work really closely with the subcontractors to absolutely minimize those on the stone and the brickwork. This is the kind of sort of obsessive nature of being an architect sometimes. And also, of course, HTS were designing out as much as they could with us of those movement joints. So we actually, what we did by using lime mortar, we actually had to have them at every horizontal junction because it's an existing building with a new facade, but we reduced the amount of vertical ones, and we also reduced the thickness of the mortar joints. And to add to that, we rubbed I didn't physically, but the subcontractor rubbed down every movement joint, the mastic, so that it toned down, it didn't stand out in the facade. And actually now you don't know they're there. Sometimes you can get away with no movement joints with lime mortar, but because of the existing structure, the deflection and movement that we had to take into account with the new facade, we couldn't remove them completely. And it also aided, of course, reducing the mortar joints from 10 mil to 8 mil. And actually, mortar seems like such a small amount of a brick facade, but I think it counts as something like 20% of the overall area. And so, you know, over a substantial building, that does have a significant impact on the overall finish. Gordon, you might have some thoughts on movement.
No, I think you're right. The general typical movement joint for a standard mortar, you would see them, whereas as you've noted, that by having this the darker, you know, reduced movement joints, we do have movement. It's an existing building, and we need to take account of that. And yeah, I think you've covered that. We've actually hidden them very well. Yeah.
Great.
We have another one from Flo Barrios. Was there an interior design team also involved in the project?
Dare I say, no, I'm quite pleased to say to be honest, architects obviously generally exteriors of buildings, but all the great architects design right down to the ironmongery, the wayfinding, all the finer details. And we were really fortunate, I think, with Kojima, who sort of gave that trust over to us to finish all of that reception space, as some of the photos showed, right down to dressing the space. So no, we did it all. At BGY, we do a lot of internal fit out projects, so both the externals and the internals. But again, I think you can really see how the very early high level conceptual approach to the building has then influenced how we've dealt with the interiors. And so that, I think that paid off, that there was that consistency of the team working on the interiors as well as the exteriors.
Did you find, you know, your design vision very quickly for how that space should look and feel?
No, I think no, it looked very different at stage 2 and 3. We actually had a separate retail unit, and we underwent lots of design sort of iterations and discussions with the client. We talked about galleries at some points, and then eventually we actually also had to lower the entire ground floor slab. Gordon and I probably should have mentioned that, to achieve that level thresholds to Coleman Street Garden. So that was a really big undertaking. So no, I wouldn't say it came around quickly, but I think grounding the design in what was existing really helps inform and enrich the outcome. So of course, the soffits, the coffered ceilings, the structural grid that then started to zone the space that I touched on, how we designed the floor finishes, and then also the history of the building being a glass making factory was a really lovely sort of point of inspiration for the wall finishes, and again picking up on those green tones in some of the fabrics. So I wouldn't say it came quickly, but one of the sort of joys or advantages of being on a project of this scale is that it lasts for 5 years. So it's something, if you have that relationship with the client, that can evolve until you get to the point you need to, rather than super quick design.
Yeah, and no doubt you collaborated with the agents as well, just to test what the market might be looking for. And
yeah, hugely. And again, I don't think this always happens with architects and agents, but we're really fortunate that we were very much aligned in kind of the prioritizing certain elements. And again, this was supported by the client. So definitely a collaborative approach.
Yeah, yeah. I can see that it's very rich and layered, and probably you really did a lot of the hard yards to get there, but very impressive. I think we're more or less approaching the end, and I'm not seeing too many other questions coming through. And I think you've really sang very well for your supper already. With some extremely comprehensive answers. So thank you for that. And frankly, the only thing missing from tonight is having the opportunity to walk around the building. You know, that's what we normally do at the City Architecture Forum. And there's nothing like getting into the space, is there? And, you know, touching those finishes and really getting a feel for things. So I guess we all look forward very much to those days and those times when we can start doing that again. But this digital series of talks is a good second best. So I hope everybody has enjoyed that. I've got a little note here via the chat from Chris Vidras, who is saying the building is open every day to visit. So thank you, Chris. Yeah, there we are. So you can actually do a follow-up now and have a look. And I will certainly be one of those who will be.
Great stuff.
Thank you very much again for a terrific talk and a very impressive presentation, as I say.